March 1944. The radio crackles over the skies of Germany. A B-17 bomber pilot, his fortress shredded by flak, 3 engines smoking, watches German fighters forming up for the kill. He keys his mic with a shaking hand. "Command, we need fighters. Request red tails, only red tails." 200 miles south, another bomber group preparing for a mission over Austria submits their escort request. Same words. Red tails only. Within 3 months, this becomes standard. White bomber crews who've never spoken to a black man in their lives, whose hometowns have segregated water fountains, are begging their command for one specific group of fighter pilots. The 332nd Fighter Group, the Red Tails, all black. 19 years earlier, the United States Army War College published an official report. The title, "The Use of Negro Manpower in War." The conclusions were presented as scientific fact. The Negro is inferior mentally, fundamentally subservient, weak character, cowardly under fire, incapable of complex decision-making required for aerial combat. This wasn't fringe racism. This was official military doctrine, signed by senior officers, filed in the War Department, used to justify every exclusion. So how does the same military, less than 2 decades later, produce fighter pilots so effective that bomber crews trust them with their lives over any white squadron? How do men branded inferior become the most requested, most revered, most feared escorts in the entire 15th Air Force? The answer is 2 wars fought simultaneously. One against the Luftwaffe at 25,000 feet. One against American racism in every briefing room, every officers' club, every promotion board. This is how they won both. 1925. Washington, D.C. The Army War College study didn't just claim inferiority, it provided systematic justification. 27 pages of pseudoscience dressed as military analysis. The authors examined cranial measurements. They cited discredited intelligence tests administered to men with no formal education, then compared results to college-educated white officers. They concluded that black men lacked the mental capacity for leadership, the emotional stability for combat aviation, the initiative for independent decision-making. The study became gospel. For 16 years, it provided the official excuse for total segregation in the armed forces. Black men could serve in support roles, mess attendants, laborers, stevedores, but combat roles, particularly anything involving technology and split-second decisions, impossible. The Negro's inferior mental capacity made it unthinkable. The tragic irony was that these conclusions were accepted by men who'd never tested them. No black pilot had been allowed to fail because none had been allowed to try. The pseudoscience became self-fulfilling prophecy wrapped in the legitimacy of official military doctrine. And it might have continued indefinitely if not for pressure building from multiple directions. For 1939-1940, the pressure mounts. War was already consuming Europe. The Luftwaffe was obliterating the Royal Air Force over Britain. American military expansion became inevitable. The black press, particularly the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender, began a calculated campaign. They published editorials demanding combat roles for black servicemen. They highlighted the hypocrisy of fighting fascism abroad while maintaining racial hierarchy at home. Then came political pressure. The 1940 presidential election was approaching. Black voters in key northern states held significant power. Civil rights organizations, led by the NAACP, made military integration a non-negotiable demand. President Roosevelt needed those votes. In September 1940, the White House announced a compromise. The Army would create a segregated black flying unit. The announcement was carefully worded. It promised training, it didn't promise combat, it didn't promise equality. It was the minimum concession necessary to diffuse political pressure while maintaining segregation. The Army brass hated it. They'd been proven right in their minds. For decades, every exclusion had been justified by the 1925 study. Now politicians were forcing an experiment they believed was doomed to fail. Fine, let them have their experiment. When it failed, when the data confirmed what the 1925 study predicted, segregation would be vindicated permanently. The location chosen for the program revealed the military's expectations: Tuskegee, Alabama. Tuskegee Institute, a black college isolated in the Deep South, remote, segregated, far from public scrutiny. If the program collapsed, it would collapse quietly. The January 1941 Tuskegee Institute, Alabama. The first cadets arrived to a base that didn't exist yet. Runways were still under construction, barracks were half-built, training aircraft were obsolete models, white flying schools had discarded years earlier. The facilities were deliberate sabotage disguised as resource allocation, but the cadets themselves shattered every assumption the 1925 study had made. They were college graduates, engineers, teachers, men who'd earned degrees from Howard University, Hampton Institute, Lincoln University. Many held civilian pilot licenses already, earned at their own expense at civilian flying schools that accepted black students. They weren't uneducated laborers being tested for capacity. They were educated men being tested against a system designed to break them. The military's solution was simple: make the standards impossible. Aviation cadets at other training facilities had to pass physical fitness tests, flight training, and ground school. The standards were demanding but achievable. At Tuskegee, the standards were higher. Physical fitness requirements exceeded white cadet standards. Flight training hours required for advancement were longer. Ground school exams were more difficult. Equipment failures that would earn white cadets a second chance earned Tuskegee cadets a washout. The official justification was that black pilots would need to be exceptional to overcome prejudice. The actual intent was elimination. If the standards were impossible, failure would seem natural. The 1925 study would be vindicated, the experiment would end. The instructors were mostly white officers, many from the South, many openly skeptical. They'd been told these men lacked capacity. Some believed it. Others were simply following orders. A few, very few, were genuinely curious whether the military's assumptions were accurate. Captain Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. entered this environment carrying weight the other cadets didn't fully grasp yet. Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. Davis had already survived one military crucible designed to break him: West Point, the United States Military Academy. He'd entered in 1932, the first black cadet, admitted in decades. The white cadets had implemented silencing. For 4 years, not one white cadet spoke to him except when officially required. No conversations, no study groups, no acknowledgement of his existence. 4 years of complete social isolation. He ate alone, studied alone. Endured it with a discipline that bordered on superhuman. He graduated 35th in a class of 276 in 1936. The academy couldn't break him. Now he was at Tuskegee, one of the first cadets, carrying the weight of proving the entire race worthy. If he failed, every racist assumption would be confirmed. If he succeeded, he'd face a military that didn't want him to succeed. Davis approached flight training with the same iron discipline that had carried him through West Point: methodical, precise, unemotional. He knew every maneuver would be scrutinized for evidence of inferiority. Every mistake would be magnified. Every success would be minimized. Other cadets matched his intensity: Charles DeBow, Mac Ross, Lemuel Custis, George Roberts. These weren't men hoping for opportunity. These were men demanding it with excellence that couldn't be denied. The training was brutal. Physical conditioning before dawn, ground school studying aerodynamics, navigation, meteorology, military tactics, then flight training in obsolete PT-17, Stearmans and BT-13 Volties, aircraft with temperamental engines and outdated instrumentation. Every flight was a test of skill and mechanical improvisation. Washout rates were savage. Of the initial 13 cadets who began training in 1941, only 5 would graduate in the first class, but those 5 would be undeniable. March 7th, 1942 graduation. The first class of Tuskegee pilots received their wings on a warm Alabama afternoon. 5 men, Captain Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., Lemuel Custis, Charles DeBow, George Roberts, McRoss. The ceremony was segregated, black spectators on one side, white officers on the other. The Army sent representatives because protocol required it, not because they celebrated. Newsreel cameras captured footage that would be shown in black communities across America. 5 men who weren't supposed to exist according to military doctrine. They'd passed every test: flight proficiency, navigation, gunnery, formation flying, ground school academics. They'd done it with older equipment, higher standards, and the weight of disproving pseudoscience on their shoulders. The celebration was muted. They'd proven they could fly, but could they fight? Would they ever be allowed to? The military had authorized training. It hadn't authorized combat deployment. The graduates had wings, but no war. That would change, but slowly, painfully, against continued resistance. Building the 99th Fighter Squadron. More classes graduated through 1941 and 1942. The numbers grew, enough pilots for a squadron. The 99th Pursuit Squadron, later redesignated the 99th Fighter Squadron, the first black flying unit in United States military history. Davis was promoted to lieutenant colonel and given command. The unit trained in fighter tactics, air-to-air combat, ground attack, bomber escort procedures. They flew P-40 Warhawks, better aircraft than the trainers, but still obsolete compared to what white fighter squadrons were receiving. The question remained, would they fight? By early 1943, the war needed pilots desperately. The Mediterranean theater was consuming aircraft and crews at unsustainable rates. North Africa, Sicily, Italy. The Army Air Force needed every qualified pilot available. Qualified. The 99th was qualified by any objective measure. In April 1943, orders finally came. The 99th Fighter Squadron would deploy to North Africa, attached to the 33rd Fighter Group, and enter combat in the Mediterranean theater. The deployment was calculated. North Africa was a secondary theater by 1943. The major fighting had moved to Sicily and would soon move to Italy. The 99th would see combat, but not the most critical combat. If they failed, the damage would be contained. If they succeeded, well, command would evaluate. The pilots knew exactly what this was, a test, another crucible. They'd proven they could fly, now they'd have to prove they could fight. April 1943 departure. The 99th shipped out from New York Harbor on a transport vessel packed with troops heading to the war. They sailed past the Statue of Liberty, that symbol of freedom, while traveling in segregated quarters below deck. They were heading to fight fascism while living under American segregation. The crossing took 2 weeks. The pilots spent the time reviewing tactics, studying intelligence reports on Luftwaffe fighters, preparing mentally for what was coming. They knew half the army expected them to fail. Some hoped they'd fail. The 1925 study still sat in War Department files waiting to be vindicated. They arrived in North Africa in late April 1943. The heat was staggering. The desert sun turned cockpits into ovens. The airfield at Farjuna was primitive, dusty, barely functional. They were assigned older P-40s that had seen extensive combat already. Maintenance was constant. Spare parts were scarce. But they had one thing the study said they'd never have: an opportunity to prove every assumption wrong. The first combat mission was scheduled for early June. The target, the island of Pantelleria between Tunisia and Sicily. A German-held fortress the Allies needed neutralized before the Sicily invasion. The pilots ran final checks on their aircraft. Davis gathered them for a final briefing. His words were simple. "Fly like you trained, execute like you know how. Don't give them any excuse." They didn't need to ask who "them" was. Everyone knew. Half the military was waiting for failure. The other half was waiting to see if the impossible might be possible. June the 2nd, 1943 was 2 days away. The 99th Fighter Squadron was going to war, and the 1925 Army War College study was about to face its first real test. The men branded inferior were about to prove exactly what they were worth. June 2nd, 1943, over Pantelleria, the P-40 Warhawks lifted off at 600 hours, 12 aircraft, 12 pilots who'd trained for this moment for 2 years. The mission was straightforward: fighter sweep over Pantelleria, an Italian-held island being pounded by Allied bombers. Destroy enemy aircraft, protect the bombers, prove you belong. Lieutenant Charles Hall flew wing position, scanning the sky with the intensity of a man who knew every maneuver would be analyzed. The Mediterranean stretched below, impossibly blue. Flak burst ahead, black puffs against clear sky. The radio crackled with position reports. Then contact, enemy fighters. Focke-Wulf FW-190s, German aircraft flown by experienced Luftwaffe pilots who didn't care about American racism, only about kills. The dogfight lasted 9 minutes. Hall maneuvered onto a FW-190's tail, 3-second burst from his 50 caliber machine guns, the German fighter trailing smoke spiraling down toward the water. The first aerial victory for a black American pilot in U.S. military history. The squadron returned to base, all 12 aircraft, no losses, 1 confirmed kill, mission success by any objective standard. Davis's after-action report was precise and understated. Mission accomplished, enemy aircraft destroyed, all pilots performed satisfactorily. He knew the report would be scrutinized for any hint of exaggeration or incompetence. Every word mattered. The reaction from command was muted. 1 kill wasn't enough data. 1 mission wasn't proof. They'd need to see more, much more. Summer 1943, the grind. The 99th flew mission after mission through the summer. Sicily, Salerno, southern Italy, fighter sweeps, ground attack runs, bomber escort. They compiled a record that was solid, professional, competent. But competent wasn't exceptional. And the 99th was being measured against a standard white squadrons never faced. Prove superiority or be declared inferior. White fighter squadrons with comparable experience and equipment were averaging similar results. Some better days, some worse. Normal variation in combat performance. But when white squadrons had mediocre missions, it was attributed to tough conditions or bad luck. When the 99th had mediocre missions, it became evidence of racial inadequacy. The equipment disparity made fair comparison impossible. The 99th was still flying war-weary P-40s while white squadrons transitioned to P-47, Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs. Aircraft that were faster, better armed, more maneuverable. The 99th made do with what they had. The pilots felt the double standard acutely. Captain Lemuel Custis described it in a letter home. "We fly the same missions, face the same flak, fight the same enemy, but they measure us with different rulers." By September 1943, the 99th had flown over 500 combat sorties. They'd lost pilots to enemy fire and accidents, the same attrition every combat squadron faced. They'd scored kills, protected bombers, completed objectives. Their combat record was nearly identical to comparable white squadrons. Nearly identical wasn't good enough. The verdict was already being written. The September 1943, the report. Colonel William Momier commanded the 33rd Fighter Group, the white unit the 99th was attached to. In September, he submitted an official report to Army Air Force Command. The title, Operations of the 99th Fighter Squadron Compared to Other P-40 Squadrons. The conclusions were devastating. The 99th, Mommier wrote, lacked the aggressive spirit necessary for combat aviation. Their teamwork was poor. Their tactical judgment was questionable. They were, in his assessment, inferior to white squadrons and should be removed from combat operations and reassigned to coastal patrol or other non-critical duties. The report included statistics carefully selected to support the conclusion. It ignored missions where the 99th performed well. It compared the squadron's results during their first months of combat to white squadrons with years of experience. It attributed every difficulty to racial inadequacy rather than equipment, experience levels, or the normal challenges of combat. The 1925 Army War College study was never directly cited. It didn't need to be. Mommier's report reached the same conclusions using the same methodology: selective data, predetermined assumptions, pseudoscience dressed as analysis. The report landed on desks at the War Department in Washington. It circulated among senior officers, many of whom had believed the Tuskegee experiment was doomed from the beginning. Here was confirmation. The Negro lacked the capacity for aerial combat. The program should be terminated. Black pilots should be removed from combat roles permanently. The report was classified, but word leaked. The black press got fragments of it. Headlines erupted. Army declares black pilots unfit for combat. Tuskegee experiment declared failure. The political pressure that had forced the program's creation now became pressure to defend it. For the pilots of the 99th still flying missions over Italy, the report was a knife in the back. They'd flown hundreds of combat missions. They'd bled. They'd lost friends to flak and enemy fighters. And their own command was declaring them inferior. The program was on the brink of collapse. Everything they'd sacrificed, everything they'd proven, was about to be erased by a report written by a man who'd decided they were inferior before he'd ever evaluated a single mission. October 1943. The defense. Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. was recalled to Washington to testify before the War Department's Advisory Committee on Negro Troop Policies. The hearing would determine whether the Tuskegee program lived or died. Davis entered that hearing carrying the weight of every black pilot, every cadet still training, every assumption the military had made about his race. He was 30 years old, a West Point graduate who'd endured 4 years of silencing, a combat commander who'd led men under fire. He was not going to let pseudoscience win. His defense was methodical and data-driven. He brought mission reports, detailed statistics, comparative analysis. He demonstrated that when the 99th's performance was compared to white P-40 squadrons during equivalent time periods with equivalent equipment, the results were statistically identical. He presented evidence that Mommier's report had cherry-picked data. It compared the 99th's first 3 months of combat to white squadrons' performance after a year of operations. It ignored the equipment disadvantages. It attributed losses to incompetence when those same loss rates in white squadrons were attributed to enemy effectiveness. Davis's testimony was precise, unemotional, undeniable. He didn't appeal to fairness or justice. He destroyed the report with its own methodology. The data, properly analyzed, proved the opposite of Mommier's conclusions. Other voices joined the defense. The NAACP presented political pressure. The black press published detailed rebuttals. Eleanor Roosevelt, who had championed the program from the beginning, made her position clear to the president. But the critical factor was the data. Davis had proven that the 99th's combat performance matched white squadrons. The differences Mommier identified were products of selective analysis, not racial capacity. In December 1943, the War Department issued its decision. The 99th Fighter Squadron would remain in combat. The Tuskegee program would continue. More black pilots would be trained, but the decision went further. The War Department authorized the formation of a complete fighter group, the 392nd Fighter Group, 4 squadrons. The 99th would be joined by the 100th, 301st, and 302nd Fighter Squadrons, all black, all trained at Tuskegee. A full complement of fighters with a new mission. Davis was promoted to colonel and given command of the 332nd. The man the military had tried to break at West Point, the pilot who'd defended his squadron with irrefutable data, would now lead the largest black flying unit in American military history. The September report had tried to kill the program. Instead, it had forced a reckoning that resulted in expansion. The 382nd Fighter Group was being born from the ashes of attempted elimination. January 1944. Ramitelli, Italy, the Red Tails. The 382nd Fighter Group established their base at Ramitelli on Italy's Adriatic coast. The base was segregated, isolated from white units. The pilots didn't care. They had new aircraft, finally. P-47 Thunderbolts initially, then P-51 Mustangs. The Mustang was the finest fighter aircraft in the American inventory. Long-range, fast, maneuverable, armed with 6 50-caliber machine guns, and they would be distinctive. The maintenance crews painted the tail assemblies bright red, easily identifiable from distance. The red tails, the visual marker, served multiple purposes. It allowed bomber crews to identify their escorts quickly. It became a symbol of pride for the pilots. And it made their performance impossible to obscure. Every mission they flew, every bomber they protected, every kill they scored would be undeniably attributed to black pilots. The 332nd's mission was specific: long-range bomber escort for the 15th Air Force. B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators flying deep into German-held territory. Oil refineries in Ploesti, Romania. Manufacturing centers in Austria. Berlin itself eventually. These bombers faced savage opposition from Luftwaffe fighters and dense flak concentrations. Losses were catastrophic. Fighter escorts had a complex mission: protect the bombers from enemy fighters. But most fighter groups also allowed their pilots to break formation and chase kills. Aerial victories meant glory, medals, advancement. A German fighter fleeing at low altitude was an easy kill if you abandoned the bombers to pursue it. The result was predictable. Fighter escorts would chase kills, and Luftwaffe fighters would use this predictable behavior to draw escorts away, then attack the now vulnerable bombers. Davis gathered his pilots before their first bomber escort mission. His orders were simple and non-negotiable. Stick with the bombers, don't chase kills, don't break formation. Our job is to bring those bombers home. Every aircraft, every crew, the Luftwaffe will try to draw you away. Don't let them. Some pilots protested. Aerial kills were how you built a combat record, how you earned recognition. Davis was unmoved. Your combat record is every bomber that lands safely because you stayed with them. That's the mission. That's the only mission. The order became doctrine for the Red Tails. Never leave the bombers. It would become their defining characteristic, the thing that transformed them from one fighter group among many to the most requested escorts in the theater. February 1944, first escort mission. The mission brief was straightforward: escort B-17s to a target in Austria. Fighter opposition expected to be heavy. The bomber crews gathered for their briefing separately in segregated facilities. They received their route, their target, their bomb loads. Then they received their fighter escort assignment, the 332nd Fighter Group, the Red Tails. The reaction among the white bomber crews was mixed. Some didn't care who protected them as long as someone did. Others had absorbed the same racist assumptions that permeated the military. Black pilots, would they actually fight? Would they be competent? The bombers lumbered into formation over Italy. 64 B-17s, each carrying 10 men, each vulnerable to the Luftwaffe fighters they knew were waiting. Then the fighters appeared, red tails brilliant against grey sky. P-51 Mustangs taking position above, below, on the flanks. The radio crackled. "Bombers, this is Red Tail Leader. We have you. All the way there, all the way back." The flight to the target took 2 hours. Flak began bursting over Austria, black puffs of shrapnel that could shred a bomber in seconds. The bombers held formation. The red tails stayed with them. Then Luftwaffe fighters appeared, Messerschmitt Bf-109s diving from altitude. The bomber crews tensed, waiting for their escorts to break formation and chase the kills. The red tails didn't break. They repositioned to intercept the German fighters before they reached the bombers, protecting, not chasing. The Luftwaffe pilots, accustomed to drawing Allied fighters away, found themselves blocked. Every attack on the bombers was met by red-tailed Mustangs that refused to be drawn out of position. 2 German fighters went down. The bombers dropped their loads and turned for home. The red tails stayed in formation all the way back. 64 bombers took off that morning. 64 bombers landed that evening. Not one lost to enemy fighters. The bomber crews climbed out of their aircraft. Some walked over to the red tail pilots on the flight line. Handshakes, thank yous. The beginning of something that would grow with every mission. The men the army had declared inferior had just brought every bomber home safely. They'd do it again tomorrow, and the day after, and again until the white bomber crews who doubted them would refuse to fly with anyone else. The Second War was being won at 25,000 feet, one protected bomber at a time. Spring 1944, the record builds, mission after mission. The 332nd flew bomber escort over Austria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania. Every mission followed the same pattern. Red tails formed up with the bombers, stayed in formation, intercepted German fighters before they reached the bomber stream, brought every bomber home. The statistics began accumulating in ways that shouldn't have been possible. 10 missions, 20 missions, 50 missions. The bomber loss rate for groups escorted by the red tails was dropping to levels that made intelligence officers double-check the numbers. Other fighter groups, flying the same aircraft, protecting the same bombers, were losing aircraft to enemy fighters at rates that had become grimly predictable. 46 bombers lost per 100 missions was the average for comparable fighter escorts in the 15th Air Force. Brutal but expected when facing experienced Luftwaffe pilots in defended airspace. The red tails' numbers were different, statistically impossible, and growing more impossible with every mission. By May 1944, the 302nd had flown over 100 bomber escort missions. Not a single bomber lost to enemy fighters. 0 white bomber crews noticed. The requests begin. It started informally. Bomber pilots talking in mess halls, comparing notes. Which fighter group stayed with you? Which ones chased kills and left you vulnerable? The red tails became the answer bomber crews gave each other. Then it became official requests. Bomber group commanders submitting escort requests to 15th Air Force operations. Request 302nd Fighter Group for tomorrow's mission. When asked why specifically the 332nd, the answers were identical. They don't leave us. By summer 1944, the scene from The Hook was playing out daily. Radio chatter over Germany, bomber pilots requesting red tails, demanding red tails, refusing to fly without them, if possible. March 1944. A B-17 pilot, his fortress damaged by flak, watching German fighters forming up. He keys his mic. Command, we need fighters. Request red tail. Only red tails. The desperation in his voice had nothing to do with doctrine or politics or race. It was the desperation of a man who knew one group of pilots would stay with him when others wouldn't. The transformation was complete. White men from segregated southern towns, men who'd grown up under the same racist assumptions, that produced the 1925 Army War College study were trusting their lives to black pilots. Not because ideology changed, because results were undeniable. The bomber crews didn't suddenly become anti-racist. Many still held prejudiced views. But at 25,000 feet over Germany, with Luftwaffe fighters diving from above, they wanted the escorts who'd proven they'd never abandon them. The Red Tails had turned trust into a combat asset more valuable than ideology. Colonel Davis understood the significance. Every mission wasn't just combat, it was proof. Every bomber brought home safely was data that demolished the pseudoscience. The 1925 study had claimed black men lacked courage, lacked judgment, lacked capacity for complex decision-making. The bomber crews requesting Red Tails were providing the rebuttal written in survival. Either the Luftwaffe perspective. German pilots noticed the Red Tails too. Luftwaffe squadrons defending Reich territory kept combat logs, tactical notes, lessons learned. The red-tailed American fighters appeared in those reports with increasing frequency. Captured German pilots, interrogated after the war, described the 332nd's tactics with professional respect. The red-tailed fighters stayed in formation. You couldn't draw them away. Other American fighters would chase you. If you dove away, the red tails wouldn't break. It made them very difficult to counter. This was respect earned through competence. German pilots didn't care about American racial politics. They cared about which Allied fighters were most dangerous. The Red Tails, through discipline and adherence to mission over glory, became feared adversaries. One Luftwaffe after-action report from summer 1944 noted, "Attack on bomber formation prevented by red-tailed escort fighters. Multiple attempts to draw escorts away from bombers unsuccessful. Recommend avoiding bomber groups with red-tail escorts if alternative targets available." The enemy was recommending avoiding the red tails. The same pilots the US Army had declared mentally inferior were now so effective the Luftwaffe preferred not to engage them. March 24th, 1945, Berlin. The mission briefing was different. The target was deeper than they'd ever flown. Berlin, the heart of Nazi Germany, 1,600 miles round trip. The longest bomber escort mission attempted by the 15th Air Force. The bomber crews received their escort assignment. The 332nd. Relief was visible on faces. The Red Tails were going to Berlin with them. 60 P-51 Mustangs, Red Tails gleaming, formed up with the bomber stream. The flight to Berlin took 3 hours, flak over Austria, fighters over Czechoslovakia. Every mile into Germany intensified the danger. Then they appeared. Messerschmitt Me-262's German jet fighters, faster than anything in the Allied inventory, sleek, deadly, representing the future of aerial combat. 3 of them, diving on the bomber formation at speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. The red-tail pilots had never faced jets before. The Me-262 could outrun a Mustang easily in level flight, but jets in 1945 had limitations. They were fast, but less maneuverable. They needed space to execute high-speed attacks. Captain Roscoe Brown saw the lead Me-262 lining up on a bomber. He pushed his Mustang into a dive, cutting off the jet's attack angle. The German pilot tried to evade, pulling into a tight turn. Too tight. The jet's speed became a liability. Brown stayed inside the turn radius, a 3-second burst from his .50 caliber guns. The Me-262 erupted in flames. 2 more red-tail pilots, Charles Brantley and Earl Lane, engaged the other jets. Same tactics. Use the Mustang's superior maneuverability to deny the jets the space they needed. Both jets went down. The 332nd Fighter Group became one of the first Allied units to shoot down German jets in air-to-air combat over Berlin on the longest escort mission of the war. Every bomber returned safely. The mission to Berlin became legendary, the first 15th Air Force fighters to escort bombers over the Nazi capital, the first to defeat Me-262s in that theatre, and not a single bomber lost. The numbers. By war's end in May 1945, the 332nd Fighter Group's combat record was complete. The statistics were undeniable. Over 200 bomber escort missions flown, more than 15,000 bomber sorties protected, bombers lost to enemy fighters while under red tail escort, zero. Not a single bomber lost to enemy fighters across more than 200 missions. Other fighter groups flying identical aircraft on identical missions lost an average of 46 bombers per 100 missions. The red tails lost 112 confirmed aerial victories, Messerschmitts, Focke-Wulfs, Heinkel bombers destroyed on the ground, and 3 Me-262 jets, 150 Distinguished Flying Crosses awarded, 744 air medals, 14 Bronze Stars, 8 Purple Hearts, and one statistic that never appeared in official records but mattered more than any medal: thousands of white bomber crew members who came home alive because red-tailed Mustangs stayed in formation when other escorts wouldn't. Legacy. Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. Returned to the United States in 1945 as a combat-proven colonel who'd commanded the most effective fighter group in the Mediterranean theater. The same military that had silenced him at West Point, that had tried to eliminate his squadron with the September 1943 report, couldn't deny the combat record. He continued serving. In 1954, he became the first black general in the United States Air Force. Later, he achieved 4-star rank, the highest rank in the military. The man the 1925 study declared mentally inferior for leadership commanded at the highest levels for decades. The Tuskegee Airmen's record demolished the pseudoscience permanently. The 1925 Army War College study was never officially retracted, but it became impossible to defend. You can't claim a race lacks courage when its pilots flew hundreds of combat missions. You can't claim inferior judgment when their tactical discipline exceeded white squadrons. You can't claim mental inadequacy when bomber crews specifically requested them. President Truman desegregated the armed forces in 1948, Executive Order 9981. The Tuskegee Airmen's combat record provided undeniable evidence that segregation degraded military effectiveness. The best escorts were being kept separate because of racism, not performance. The change wasn't driven by morality alone, it was driven by data. The red tails had proven that excellence has no color, that institutional racism creates arbitrary barriers to capability, that prejudice makes bad military doctrine. 1945. Italy, the handshake. A B-17 touches down at its base in Italy. The mission was rough, flak over Vienna, fighter attacks over Austria, but the red-tailed Mustangs stayed with them. Every attack intercepted, every bomber protected, the crew climbs out, shaking off the adrenaline. They're alive. 10 men who left this morning, not certain they'd return, are standing on solid ground because of the fighters they can see landing now. 3 crew members walk across the tarmac to where the red-tail pilots are climbing out of their cockpits. A handshake, white bomber pilot and black fighter pilot. Neither man speaks the same language of their civilian lives, one from Mississippi, the other from Chicago. They'd never have met except for this war. They wouldn't have spoken in 1941 because military doctrine said one was superior and one was inferior. But here, in 1945, on an airfield in Italy, one man is alive because the other kept a promise. The promise to never leave the bombers. The promise Davis gave in January 1944 and every red-tail pilot kept for 200 missions. No words needed. The handshake said everything. This was what the 1925 Army War College study couldn't predict. That excellence would prove stronger than pseudoscience, that men declared inferior would become the most requested, that survival would override ideology, that respect would be earned with every bomber brought home safely. The Red Tails didn't just fight the Luftwaffe, they fought institutional racism with the only weapon that couldn't be dismissed: undeniable results. 112 aerial victories proved they could fight. 0 bombers lost proved they could protect. 200 missions proved they could sustain excellence under the harshest scrutiny any pilots ever faced. And they won both wars, and the handshake on that Italian airfield was the victory ceremony the 1925 study said would never happen. The men branded inferior had proven exactly what they were: the best escorts in the sky,